Okay, I will take your questions. Yes.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So you're making the point with forced labor earlier.
Yeah.
And that was very interesting because it makes sense in a lot of different ways, but I can think of a couple of situations where they would argue, and people have argued that, yeah, you can't force them to do anything, but when it comes to certain kind of topics or certain kind of specific cases, there are obligatory jobs that you can't strike from, for instance. And they say, and a lot of them would say, oh, so the medical profession is one. I think a lot of people are saying, well, in Ireland, it's kind of, there's a lot of rural spots. So in certain areas, even though the vote has gone a certain way, GPs, say all the GPs in a certain area say, no, I don't want anything to do with it.
Right.
Then that area doesn't get their right in that case.
Right.
And they kind of throw parallels to, if you're an ambulance driver and you get to a case and the guy has a swastika on his chest tattooed, and, oh, okay, well, I'm not going to do anything. They say, like, no, you're obliged to treat the person and not impose certain things. So I find that very difficult.
Yeah. Great question. So what do we do about other cases where it seems like we would force labor? For example, the ambulance driver who comes across the racist with a swastika and doesn't feel comfortable driving around. I think that situation is very different. I think if you're you're talking about an area where his obligation is to try as best as he can to save a person's life. I think ambulance drivers, lifeguards, doctors should be required to do their best for their patient. But pro-life doctors, when a pro-choice woman comes to them wanting an abortion, they believe that there are two patients in front of them, the woman and the baby, and they just don't want to be forced to dismember one of the patients. So I think it's actually a difference in kind. It's not a difference in degree, it's a difference in kind. They're making an analogy. It sounds good on the surface, but when you dig deeper, you see these are not parallel. And so what I would be interested in hearing is, can they come up with a parallel situation where it seems like we should force a doctor? For example, should we force doctors to euthanize patients, even if the doctor is against euthanasia? Like, that would be kind of a parallel case because you're talking about killing someone. I'd be interested in, and feel free to jump back in if you've heard of a different parallel that seems like it's more analogous to abortion. I don't think the ambulance driver one works at all.
So a lot of those people would also agree with euthanasia as being...
Sure. And so, and you could say, okay, well, I'm against doctors being forced to kill anybody. And so can you think of another example of a person that should be forced to kill someone that maybe I would agree with, that you could try to use to persuade me to your side? Because my view is it's fine to force doctors to try to help people. It's not okay to force doctors to kill people.
And what about obligatory referral?
I don't know what that phrase means.
So I won't do it, but then I have to send your case to someone who will do it.
Got it. My personal view is that doctors should not be forced to say, here's where you can get an abortion. That's a harder case. That's going to be a harder one to win. But my view is Google's a thing. Like, I don't understand why the pro-abortion lobby, and I'm talking about people who I think are truly pro-abortion, are saying, like, this poor girl is not going to be able to find someone to do an abortion if the first guy she comes to or first doctor she comes to refuses to do it. Like, you can find out where to get an abortion. There are all kinds of ways to find out where to get an abortion. Why are you trying to force words out of this guy's mouth? I don't think forced speech is an okay thing. So this is an area where I agreed with Jordan Peterson. And when Jordan Peterson was fighting against saying, like, you have to use someone's preferred gender pronoun. It's not that he had a problem using people's gender pronouns. He didn't want the government to force him to do it. He said in the history of Russia and the Soviet Union, forced speech is a first step to a lot of really, really bad things. We should never do that. And so I think this is something similar here. Is they're trying to force the doctor to say things that he morally objects to. I have a big problem with that. I think it'll be easier for your movement to at least protect him from not having to do the abortions. But if you can get him to also not be forced to say, go get abortion down the street, I think that is better and is more moral. But we'd have to see how it goes.
What would the arguments for fighting against obligatory?
I mean, basically what I just said. I would say, see, it's like if the pro-choice movement is saying we need obliged referral in order for her to be able to get an abortion, I would just say that's clearly false. People have a more access to information now than they ever had in the entire history of the human race. Like, what are you talking about? Like, that seems silly. Like, well, let's not pretend like the internet's not a thing. How? Go ahead.
You had a brilliant argument for that during the temporary thing.
What was it? Tell me the brilliant thing I said.
Gun.
The gun story.
The gun. So like, if you didn't have a gun, directing the person to your next door neighbor who has a gun. You know, basically.
I said that?
Yeah.
Using an analogy.
Yeah, analogy. Yeah.
What was the analogy? I don't remember this. Was this on the Skype call we did?
No, this is during the
This is the other day?
I think you're trying to think of an analogy. So, like, you don't want to murder someone,
Yeah.
but I know my friend will do the
Yeah.
murder for you. And
I don't even-
equivalence.
That's pretty good. I don't remember saying that, but that's how jet lagged I am. Who else has a question?
I'm sure you've probably heard of the bill that we brought in 2013, Protection Life During Pregnancy, or to terminate pregnancies. But basically, that was kind of the first step to opening, doors for abortion. But basically, that allowed abortions in case where the life of the mother was in danger, and contained within that stipulation was that if the mother was suicidal, that abortion was allowed up to 9 months essentially.
Right.
How would you answer someone who said, how do you manage a woman who's suicidal over her pregnancy?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the way that we manage someone who is suicidal is we try to help them. And if someone is truly suicidal and is like suicidal in a way like they're not just talking about suicide, but they're like starting to plan to do it and plan how they're going to do it and when they're going to do it, you're talking about what psychologists consider at that point they've crossed a threshold into a more urgent scenario. I was just talking with a psychologist about this recently because I was actually having to deal with a friend of mine who has been saying suicidal things for a long time. And so he talked to me a lot through about like there's just a big difference with someone who just kind of like talks this way and sometimes there might be different motivations, including maybe trying to get attention, trying to get people to say nice things. Might actually kind of mean to some extent, but there's a difference when they start actually planning to do it, planning how they're going to do it, planning when they're going to do it. That's a different situation. At that point, it's very urgent. And you need to be calling like emergency services and getting them help because at that point it's a very, very dangerous situation. And people like me are not equipped to help someone in that situation, like seeing these emergency services. So I think that person should be contained in a way that they will be safe. Obviously, we want it to be like the least forceful as possible and the most gentle and all of that, but I do believe that it is okay to stop someone from committing suicide. And a lot of these people have been stopped from committing suicide, and days or weeks or months later, we're very glad that they were. They were going through a very, very bad moment. It's not an everlasting moment, but it was a very bad moment at the time where it seemed like they had no hope. And so in a case here, this is like, imagine having a suicidal person that's just got a baby strapped to her. Like there's two lives at risk here. And so naturally, I would still say we've got to help the person. What does he need? What kind of support does he need? What kind of emotional support does he need? Does he need chemical support even? Like I think I do believe that the brain is a very complicated thing, and sometimes people really need certain kinds of medications to help kind of get certain things leveled out. I'm not against all people can be over medicated or too quickly medicated, but I do believe that medication can be very, very important. But I wouldn't just say, if she's saying, I'm going to kill myself if I can't have an abortion, okay, fine. Send her to kill the baby. I think there are better ways to try to help both of them. Yes?
The equal rights argument
Yes.
seems to work really well, but I have eventually, I think if you go deep enough, you do find the people who say, okay, yeah, no, I acknowledge that they're a person, and I acknowledge that they have a right to life, but also sometimes it's okay to kill people.
Right.
Like I remember reading they made the argument of, I think it's Thompson's Violinist. I think.
Mm-hmm.
They say, okay, yeah, sure, I mean, it's problematic, but you do have the right to kill your child because they're infringing upon your body.
Yep. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to give a short answer to this question. And if people run out of questions, I'll expand on it. This is a whole talk that I did in Tipperary. But we have this as part of the course that you're about to have access to. So probably be a better use of time if I just give you a short answer now and tell you like we've got about an hour-long module on this. It's a very important part of the abortion debate because I think at the foundation of pro-choice people's beliefs, the foundational thing, the core thing that matters to them is actually not their view that the unborn is not like you and me. The foundational thing has to do with women's bodily autonomy. It's that it would be a government overreach to force women to not be able to do something with their body. It would be too restrictive of personal freedom. And Thompson's violinist is one of the best examples of this. So just for the sake of the room, let me explain what Thompson's violinist is, and then I'm going to give you 2 quick ways to respond to it. But it's not the complete answer, but it deals with most abortions. So 1971, Judith Jarvis Thompson from MIT writes one of the most important papers in modern philosophy called A Defense of Abortion, with lots of thought experiments that are meant to defend legal abortion. But by far, one of the thought experiments is the most famous, is the violinist story. So here's the idea. You wake up in a hospital bed, not where you went to sleep. And first thing you notice is a tube coming out of your body into a man in a coma in the bed next to you. At this point, the head of the hospital rushes in and says, "You're awake. Oh my gosh, let me tell you what's going on. Okay, I'm so sorry. This is so unfair. The person in the bed next to you is a world-famous violinist with a kidney problem. And you were kidnapped by the Society of Music Lovers. They somehow figured out you're a kidney match. They kidnapped you, they hooked you up, and then they left you here. And we're in a dilemma because, you see, the violinist, he's a person. He has the right to life. And so we can't unplug you or he will die. But the good news is you only have to be plugged in for 9 months. And then he'll be viable, and then we can unplug you and you both can go your merry ways." And Thompson says this is a lot like pregnancy, where even if pro-lifers are right that it's a person, it would be wrong to force you to be hooked up to another person. And most people would agree, including most pro-life people would agree, it would be wrong to be forced to remain hooked up to the violinist. Philosophers would call, if you decided to stay hooked up to the violinist, I think the right category of this would be to call this a supererogatory act. In other words, a morally laudable act, like you're going above and beyond the call of duty. Pin a medal to that guy, like that kind of thing. I know a few Christians who would call it a morally obligatory thing to remain hooked up, coming from their theological views about loving your neighbor more than yourself, kind of a thing. But almost no one thinks that there should be a legal, like, violinist amendment to the Constitution, kind of a thing. Like, whereas, like, says, like, you will be handcuffed to the bed. And Thompson says, see, pro-lifers, abortion should be legal even if you're right that it's a person. Now, just stop for a moment. Do you see how powerful that argument is? There's this, like, big pro-life apologist speaker who was telling a story about when he first heard this argument on the radio. He had to pull his car over because he was like, oh my goodness, I think they might win. That might be the winning argument. And then he took some time and he found some problems with it. So there are problems with the analogy. It is not an argument, I think, that wins, but it's very powerful. And pro-life people need to understand the argument and know how to respond to it effectively. And there are some pro-life arguments that you're going to hear that are not persuasive responses to the violinist. And then there are some arguments that are persuasive to pro-choice people. Because that's what I'm interested in. I'm not just interested in what is true. I'm interested in what works. What is actually persuasive to today's young pro-choice people? And so here are 2 responses I think work very, very well. The first thing is to show that this argument is inherently extremist. If the way you're grounding the right to abortion is by saying a woman should not be forced to be hooked up to anybody, then that means that there should be 0 restrictions on abortion. And that is not what most pro-choice people think. Most pro-choice people think that at least late-term abortions should be against the law. They think sex selection abortion should be against the law. Well, that's not possible if the way that you ground your pro-choice belief is she shouldn't be forced to be hooked up to someone. Because where is that someone in the 3rd trimester? It's still in her body, right? But this is an area where their views are going to actually contradict themselves. So you want to point that out. Second, real quick, other argument that I would be making, at least it's not the only next argument I make, but it'd be the next thing that I would say, is I would make what we call the responsibility objection. The responsibility objection says that when you have consensual sex, you're engaging in an act that you know might result in the creation of an inherently needy child that you owe compensation to. Let me give you a quick thought experiment to explain that idea. Imagine an empty room with a baby making machine in it. It looks like a Coke machine. It's got a big button, and then there's a chute at the bottom. If you push the button, you will have a very pleasurable experience. But every once in a while, a baby comes out the chute at the bottom. So this guy walks up to the table. He wants the pleasurable experience, but he does not want a baby to come out. So he's rolling the dice. So he pushes the button, but sure enough, a baby comes out the bottom. It seems really obvious that, even to a lot of pro-choice people we talk to, that he shouldn't be allowed to just walk away and abandon the baby to starve to death. And he clearly shouldn't be allowed to directly kill it, like bash its brains in or something, right? Why? Because he pushed the button. In other words, he engaged in an act that he knew might result in the creation of an inherently needy child that he now owes compensation to. In other words, he needs to either care for the child, because he's the one that caused it to be created, or transfer that care to someone else. That's fine. That would be like adoption. But he can't kill it. He pushed the button. That morally matters. That is such a good response to the violinist argument that Michael Tooley, one of the smartest pro-choice philosophers alive, said one time in a debate. He admitted he doesn't use bodily rights arguments at all because he said the responsibility objection crushes the violinist. Now, there's an open question here. This does not refute abortion in the case of rape. So this is not a finished lecture on bodily rights arguments. And we've got a lot to say about that 1% left over that I'm not going to do right now before time, but it's in the course. And I'll just say, even if you get the pro-choice person to agree with you on that, you just got them to agree that 99% of abortions should be against the law. That's huge. And that's a lot of win for one day. And you should walk away with your head high. Yes, Gavin?
Josh, I have a question.
Yeah.
Relating to, what do you think a good approach to protesting is, and like making our voices heard? So I think in Ireland we have a tricky situation where abortions unfortunately are happening now, but they're happening in places where a lot of other sensitive activities are going on.
Mm-hmm.
So the abortions are happening, unfortunately, in our maternity hospitals and in our ordinary, people are being given abortion pills in our GP general surgeries,
Yeah.
local doctor.
Yeah.
And so I'm just wondering what you think a good approach to that is.
Yeah, that's a great question. And that is a huge challenge for you in Ireland. We were talking about this actually just a week ago with the pro-life group from Scotland. SPUC, anyone know the guys from SPUC? They're awesome. So SPUC, they send a group of young people now to Washington, D.C. every year for the March for Life and the Students for Life conference. And now it's kind of become a tradition that we'll also go and hang out with them for a couple of hours. And we love them and they love us. And it's really just lots of love. And so we were actually talking about this. They have the same situation. Most of the abortions happen in hospitals over there. And that is just a huge challenge. Because we're in America, some abortions happen in hospitals, but most of them happen in standalone abortion clinics. Like Planned Parenthood, their clinics, usually they will do both. They will do abortions, but then they give up birth control and they do other things. And so you don't really know every time someone walks into Planned Parenthood to see her for an abortion or something else. Sometimes you can tell. Sometimes you can tell she's pregnant. And there are actually other little subtle markers that you can pick up if you do enough, if standing outside of an abortion clinic. But with a hospital, you've got a much smaller percentage of people that are walking in for an abortion versus something else. And so that just makes it a lot trickier. Like, generally speaking, the sidewalk counseling techniques that we teach in our new online course aren't going to work for you here. I do think that it would be legitimate to protest a hospital that does abortions, but I think you should do it in a way that is not going to be unnecessarily inflammatory. You want it to be as persuasive as possible. So if there was, let's use a slavery analogy. If you had a place where they mainly sold food, but like, let's say 5% of the sales, welcome. Let's say 5% of the sales were slaves. I think it would be legitimate to protest that place of business as long as they are selling slaves. It's not that you're against the food being sold. You're just saying, I got a problem with this place selling slaves. It's really wrong to sell slaves. But I would, especially if I were a slave, and I was like, I'm hoping for a successful protest, a successful way of getting the culture turned around toward abolishing slavery, I would want that protest to be as persuasive as possible. And that might take some testing. And it also takes some understanding of how pro-choice people think. I think this is one of the most important things that we do at ERI, is helping pro-life people understand pro-choice people, which is rare. Let me take a minute and explain what I mean by that. This is really important. Psychological studies have shown that people on the right side of politics, the right, not correct, but like the right versus left side of politics, their brains tend to be wired differently than people on the left. Did you know that? Jordan Peterson talks about this too. I don't agree with everything Jordan Peterson says. I feel like I now have to say because I've referenced him twice now. I don't agree with everything he says. I think he's super interesting. I think the Kathy Newman debate is hilarious. If you haven't watched him doing the Kathy Newman thing on Channel 4, you have to watch it because it's amazing. I've watched it 3 times, and it's great every time. And it's a half an hour long, but it's just bliss. But he has some weird views too, anyway, whatever. But he's a trained psychologist. This is his area of true expertise is in clinical psychology. And so he's talked about this. So people on the right tend to be driven by 2 primary things. We've got 2 primary drivers motivating us. One is reaction to disgust, and the second one is something like traditionalism. In other words, not wanting our culture to change too fast, lest we lose the things that we love. People on the left, not so much. They are driven by compassion and openness to new experiences. This does not mean that people on the right are not compassionate, but it's not one of our primary drivers, okay? So that means that we think differently. This is so important because the common human mistake that many, many pro-life activists and leaders make is a very human mistake of projecting onto people who are different from them what would be persuasive to themselves. So most of us would react very negatively to seeing a graphic picture of what abortion does to babies because that's the way our brain is wired. Many people on the left, they are not wired to react to disgust that way. So it just bounces off. Not always. I've seen certain people persuaded by seeing graphic science. Like, people are complicated. But generally speaking, that's not the way their brains are wired. But people on the right are like, well, of course this would be the most convincing thing because it would be the most convincing thing to me. They wouldn't say it like that, but that's what's going on. And I'm not like making fun of them or attacking them or anything, or maligning them. Everyone does this. And we need to be careful about it. It's a psychological mistake. So I want to help the pro-life movement to understand how do pro-choice people actually think, which means we're teaching a foreign language. Like you have to understand what makes them tick if you're going to understand how to change their minds. And it's probably different than what would change your mind. And so, well, now let's apply that to protests. The question is, how do we deal with the fact that abortions happen in hospitals and not everything happening in hospitals are abortions, so that makes protesting a lot more complicated. I would want to figure out, if you're going to protest that a hospital does abortions, then I would want to figure out what is going to be the way to do that is most persuasive to the people you want to convince. You don't need to convince other pro-lifers. You need to convince pro-choice people. So, in America, a very common way of protesting is with big graphic signs of abortion. I've done it. I've done that a lot. I have a lot of experience standing under literally 18-foot tall graphic pictures of abortion victims. I've had a lot of experience talking to people in front of those signs. I've also had a lot of experience talking to people where there's no graphic signs around, but we have them in a brochure. And what we do at ERI is we have a brochure. We actually sell it now. This is actually brand new, but well, it's not that brand new, but we sell it now. It's cheap. But what we have is an area where it's just fetal development images. And then we have a second section that is first trimester abortion pictures. And then we have a final section with a very, very graphic picture of a late-term abortion. One of the worst pictures I've ever seen, and one that we actually debated even putting in our brochure because it is so awful, we don't even want to see it. But it's important because it's powerful. It's a powerful way to respond to bodily autonomy arguments. Because again, bodily autonomy arguments have to say there should be no restrictions on abortion, including the abortion that's in that picture. And so we only show graphic images with consent. We'll ask the person, I want to make sure we're on the same page of what we're talking about. I'm not sure if we're talking about the same thing. Will you be willing to see a picture of what it is that we're talking about? I think it's an important evidence. And they will usually say yes. They will usually agree. Because no one really wants to be like, no, I want to hide from the facts. They will see. I'll be clear. This is not a photoshopped image. This is not a fake, anything. This is real. So they'll see it. And then I get all the benefits of the graphic image. Because I do think this is important for pro-choice people to see. But they have to see it on their terms for it to reach them, usually. Obviously, again, there are exceptions. I've seen the exceptions. But they need to see it and not feel violated. Because when they are surprised by seeing a big sign, they tend to feel violated. They are mad at you, not mad at what's on the sign, which is not, it doesn't make moral sense, but it is the way that they react. And they're upset and they're concerned for post-abortive people who would see these images, or people who even have miscarriages to see the images. They're concerned about all these other things. They're not getting the message you're trying to give them. And so this is an example of how we have changed the way that we, protest is the wrong word here because we're on campuses trying to have dialogues, but we've changed the way that we look when someone comes across us. As another example, so I've been doing a lot of research on the pro-life movement in Ireland and prep for this sort of last-minute series of talks that kind of got put together. And I've read a bunch of articles in your Ireland papers about the pro-life movement. And you know what? There's a picture that I keep. It's the same picture. And I see it, and I feel like every other article that I read. You've seen the picture. It's a picture of a pro-life protest going on outside of one of your hospitals with a bunch of white coffins. If I were in charge, I wouldn't want people to see that picture, because I don't think that paints your movement in good light. I think the people with the coffins are very, very well-meaning. I would never malign their character, especially knowing basically nothing about them. I'm just saying, as an outside consultant who understands pro-choice people better than most, I believe, pro-choice people will see that image, and their reaction is not going to be, oh, weird. There's coffins. That's interesting. I wonder why oh, because abortion kills babies, and that's wrong. That's not the way they're going to react. They're going to react by saying something like, what disgusting pieces of crap are outside this hospital that clearly don't care about women, don't care about women who are having abortions, don't care about women who are having miscarriages, don't care about women who are having their babies in this hospital. They've got these coffins out here. They are clearly terrible human beings. I would never talk to them. And if that's what pro-lifers are like, then I'm not ever interested in becoming like that. I'm sorry, that is the way pro-choice people react to stuff like that. Unless pro-choice people in Ireland are very, very different than in America. And I don't think so, because pro-lifers in Ireland aren't super, super different from pro-lifers in America. I know there's cultural differences. I don't think they're so extreme that pro-choice people are going to see those images and be like, wow, I'm in. I wish more abortions might happen as a result of the white coffins, because if that makes it take 5 years longer for you to make abortion illegal, because you've got to get the culture that much more on your side and it's that much slower, if that's what happens, that's a lot of abortions. That's thousands and thousands and thousands of abortions that maybe wouldn't have had to happen. So this matters. And I want to help you guys to be effective. There you go. Those are some thoughts. Yes?
I have a question, and I wrote it down. We are thinking of having the White Cross movement, which is basically just white crosses on the grass. And we were thinking of having this on our campus if we're gonna be accepted by them. Do you think that's a good idea?
Yes. I'm fine with the white crosses. It's going to bother some people. And so you might be like, ooh, man, does that mean that Josh wouldn't have liked this? No, I'm not against everything that bothers people, but I'm against things that unnecessarily bother people. Like any kind of pro-life activity is going to bother certain people. That doesn't mean that we should all hide in our homes, but we shouldn't be unnecessarily offensive. So there's this really great quote from a Christian apologist named Greg Koukl. He said, the gospel message is offensive enough. Let's not add offense to it. I would say the same thing about the pro-life message. The pro-life message is offensive enough. Let's not add more offense to it unnecessarily. I think the white crosses are a great way where you can say, like, here's, and have a certain number based on something. Base it on, one cross represents 10 abortions a year in Ireland or something like that. Have a number, something you can explain to people. Here's why there's 50 crosses or 500 crosses or whatever it is. Have that kind of everyone trained in that. And make sure every single person there is already equipped to have dialogues with pro-choice people. So they need to have finished our course, probably, right? Or I mean, there's other ways, but I think the best way is with a course. And so because you're going to have conversations. That is a way to draw people to you to have conversations. And so setting up a poll table with something there that says, should abortion remain legal? Yes, no, it depends, and pads of paper and stuff like that would be a great way to kind of like direct the people who want to come up and talk to there. They might be a bit more upset than they would be if you only set up the poll table. So I think you should try both. I think it'd be very interesting to see how your pro-choice movement reacts to the white crosses. In America, I think it is one of the less, like on the spectrum, one of the less offensive kinds of things that pro-life people put up. I think it is unreasonable to be upset at it, but some people will be, so expect that. And if you end up decided we want to do something that's a little bit even less offensive on the spectrum because we think it'll be more effective, then that could be reasonable. But I don't think the crosses are unnecessarily offensive. Yeah.
Sorry, just on the debate and discussion, does the dynamic change if you're debating in front of an audience? So like you were saying there about the body language and all of
Yes.
that. In terms of in a TV studio, how does the debate, when you're not focused on changing the mind of the individual
Yes.
in front of you and more the people spectating, how does that change? Or
That is a really good question. Yes, it is different. So I've done 4 debates, and in the 4 debates that I've done, I wasn't trying to convince my debate opponent. I'm just expecting that person is not going to change their mind, or at least not tonight. It's the audience that I'm going after, or the TV audience, or whatever. And so I believe that in a debate, you should be a bit more pointed and a little bit more argumentative than the way that we teach. You should also try to be humorous. I believe that right now the best pro-life debater, at least that I've seen, is Trent Horn, who works at Catholic Answers. He has a couple of abortion debates on YouTube. Go watch those. Trent is witty. He's quick on his feet. And he makes people laugh, but he's also really smart. He and I don't always use the same arguments as far as the philosophy goes. That's an area of respectful disagreement, but he's a really good guy and a good friend, and I think he's our best debate person right now for those reasons. I expect that at some point in the not-so-distant future, I will start doing debates again, which means that in prep for that, I'm going to be trying to kind of, even better than I did before, learn the art of debate. And I just understand that's different than dialogue. And so I'm going to have pre-written kind of witty lines, or not even always witty, but very to the point, very rhetorically polished, which is something, I don't think that's the thing that I'm naturally very good at. I am really, really good at taking my time with someone one-on-one and making them feel receptive. But I'm not like this automatic, putting things really rhetorically well. Like my brother Tim is excellent at that, and that's just not an area that I excel. So we would be like pre-working on that stuff. And at some point I'm going to be doing that again because frankly, some people they don't take you super seriously unless you do more like lots of debates and stuff like that. So I'll do that at some point. It's not a very big priority for me right now, but absolutely it's different. Be very well practiced, be respectful. I mean, watch the Jordan Peterson, Kathy Newman debate. I mean, like that's an example where she's totally going after him super pointedly. And it's not working the way that it has worked for Kathy Newman in the past with certain people. It's not working on him because he's ready, he's deflecting it, he's even kind of laughing at the way that she's arguing with him. In a way that I don't think was mocking, or at least at one point maybe he got a little bit close to the line of mocking. But like generally it was just like, this lady's acting weird. That's not what I'm saying. Here's what I'm saying. Like that kind of thing, So study great debates. William Lane Craig would be another one. If you're going to do debates, study the hell out of William Lane Craig. He is probably the best debater in Christianity. Even if you're not a Christian, you should study William Lane Craig. Because atheists, like the really smart atheists, are terrified of William Lane Craig. He is so smart and he is so good. And he'll do things that even I apply to my dialogues. For example, William Lane Craig is an expert at making his opponent's case stronger before defeating it. So that the opponent would be like, there can't be a God because there's all these horrible things going on in the world, and a good God wouldn't allow these terrible things to happen, as if it's a new argument. And William Lane Craig will first be like, oh, you think that example is bad? Let me tell you what's really bad. Let me tell you about this thing going on in India. And then like, really, just a horrifying story. Like, dig his own grave deeper, and then get out of it. And I do that in my dialogues. Someone will make a weak pro-choice argument, and I'll be like, oh, you can do better than that. Let me show you. I think maybe you're trying to say something better. Here, like really smart pro-choice people, like they would study this a lot, they would tweak that, and they would say, no, better argument would be this. And they'll be like, ooh, I like that. Let's go with that. I'm like, cool. And then I refute it. That's so impressive to people. Like they don't know what to do with that. Like, because at this point, now they know something great. Now they know that I know their argument better than they do. And I know my argument obviously better than they do. And then they've got to wonder, well, geez, if he can make my argument better than I can, and he doesn't agree with it, maybe there's a good reason why. That's a great thing to be. So study William Lane Craig versus Christopher Hitchens. There's a great debate at Biola that he did that gives you kind of an example of the way that he argues. And I think Jordan Peterson and people like that. Yes.
I have a question. When it comes to these conversations, a lot of my classmates just haven't thought it through.
Yep.
And we end up with super blatant contradictions on their part, and I just don't know. Like, it kind of just dies because it doesn't make sense, and I don't know. For instance, one of my friends is a super hardcore relativist, and it came to the point where it came to a conversation where I said, well, if someone comes up and says 1 + 1 is 3, I'll tell them 100% of the time that they're wrong. But she went the next step and said, well, if that person really thinks that 1 + 1 is 3, that's her truth. Oh, gosh. And it was kind of, like, at that point, like, I really didn't know what to say.
Yeah, I don't blame you.
I just, but then, so obviously I'm hoping that she's thinking about that. Maybe she is, maybe she's not.
Well, I mean, your view was true for you, so.
Yeah, but and then she went on to say that she's gonna devote her career to make sure that no man can whatever, and so it's kind of funny in that way. But another person went on to say that, oh, I believe that's a human, but that human doesn't have human, like, you don't get human rights immediately after becoming human.
Yeah.
But then I didn't really know where to go with that either.
Yeah. Okay, so let's treat these as two separate cases, and let's talk about them both. These are really good cases. Okay, so on the first one, is there anyone here that doesn't know what moral relativism is? Okay, good. There's at least one person, and some of you maybe not raising your hand. That's fine. Moral relativism is a morally bankrupt view that says that moral truth, at least moral truth, is subjective instead of objective. So we believe, hopefully all of us believe, that moral truth is an objective thing. It's an objective reality. Regardless of whether different people disagree, there is a right and wrong answer to important moral questions. And a relativist would say, no, it's subjective. And they might say it's subjective based on a culture. So like, it would be wrong for people in Ireland who are against cannibalism to tell a culture in, let's say, Africa or some island that it's wrong to do cannibalism because that's their culture, and maybe in their culture that's right for them, kind of a thing. More commonly, you hear exactly what you heard, which is more of an individualistic version of relativism that says, well, what's true for me might not be true for you, and what's true for you might not be true for me. Which effectively in the conversation is kind of a conversation ender. Because what do you do? Well, here's what you don't do. You don't keep arguing about abortion. Like, well, I've seen well-meaning pro-life students do this. Like, we'll take them out to do an outreach. And this, let's say, like, a pro-life girl will be talking to this, like, relativist guy. And the guy is like, I don't believe anything is objectively wrong. And effectively what the pro-life girl then goes on to do is like, well, abortion is. And it's like, but it's like, no, I don't think anything's wrong. It's like, yeah, but abortion is objectively wrong. It's like, it doesn't work. They're talking past each other, right? And so what we want, this is a point where, and there's multiple cases of this, where I will abandon abortion altogether. And I'm going to go full frontal assault on his bad worldview. If utilitarianism comes up, I'm going to do this too. I'm not going to get a utilitarian to be pro-life. Or at least if I did, it'd be a really weird argument that I don't know how to put it together. If they bite the bullet on infanticide, if they're like, yeah, well, maybe you can kill infants sometimes. I'm not going to keep on arguing about embryos. Embryos are a less obvious case. I'm going to talk about the newborns. Like, let's see if I can at least convince them on that. Like, that's crazy. Same thing with relativism. You're not going to get a moral relativist to believe that anything is objectively wrong, by definition. So I'm going to try to convince them to not be a relativist. I will probably fail. It almost never works. Relativists almost never change their mind in one day. I've seen it happen twice in over 1,000 conversations I've had. Now, to be fair, I haven't only talked to relativists, so I don't really know what the win-loss percentage is. It's probably 2%, something like that, which is not good odds. But there's a couple different things you can try. I've got a link for you to write down. blog.equalrightsinstitute.com. This is our blog. Our blog is kind of a separate site than the nonprofit website where you can donate, because it just works better as a blog. We've got a couple of 100 articles here on the blog. But if you go to the blog, you might want to bookmark this one page. You can see it at the top. It says archives. Bookmark that. I go here all the time because we have articles about just about everything now. So I often get questions sent to me, what should I say about this? And I'll just go to the archive, and I kind of know all the article titles, and so I can just do a word search and quickly find a thing. If you word search relativism in our archives, or even search for it here, there's like a search feature too, you're going to find two different articles. One is by me and one is by my brother. And they've got two different strategies that will, like, if anything will work, they will potentially work depending on the type of relativist you're talking about. One of them, the one that I use most often, is to try to get them in touch with the conscience that I think God gave them. Unless they're like blocked, psychologically blocked by sociopathy or psychopathy. I think psychopaths don't seem to be in tune with their conscience because of a medical issue. I talked to a sociopath one time. I talked to this guy one time that was like, first thing he said was, those graphic signs over there, it was back when I was using graphic signs, they just make me hungry. Like, they don't affect me at all. It just looks like whatever. It just looks like noodles. But he also said, but I'm a where's the word? Diagnosed sociopath. I could kill you right now. It would affect me not at all. It's like, wow. And I kind of joked, why shouldn't I be backing away right now? But I kind of did it jokingly because I didn't really feel in danger. And he kind of laughed. And he's like, well, because I've kind of learned society's rules. And it's in my self-interest to follow them. And it's like, oh, okay. But he was so convinced and like confident in his own moral reasoning. Like, he's like, I know what's right and wrong. And I was like, dude, I've never talked to someone who should be less confident in his own moral compass. Like, you, like, really, like, you should really, like, with a lot of doubt, like, I probably am thinking badly about the case. Anyway, that was that conversation. So, anyway, most people have a conscience that maybe is numbed. Maybe they've trained their conscience to be numb to certain things like abortion, which is why sometimes thought experiments about other terrible things will help, that are analogous to abortion, might help them to see what's wrong. Because that's the way humans are. If you do the same wrong thing or sin or however you want to define it a lot, you become numb to that thing. This is true of abortion too. There's an abortion practitioner who once talked about how it was hard to do his first trimester abortions, his first D&C abortions. He said that was hard. But as he did more and more and more, they became easier. And then he said, after I'd done thousands of first trimester abortions, it was very easy. But then he said he did his second trimester abortion. And a second trimester abortion, you have to use a different procedure if you're using a dismemberment procedure. Because at this point, the bones have calcified. They're harder. And so you literally have to go in and rip the limbs off with a twisting motion. And they've described how they can feel that sensation like an electric current down their arms. And he said that was really hard the first time I did a second trimester abortion. And he said, but then I did another and another. And by the time I'd done 10,000, it was not hard anymore. Like, that's how humans are made. And it's true of us too. I'm sure we can all self-reflect and see there are things in our lives that we don't want to have in our lives that we become numb to. So I am trying to get a relativist in touch with this constant. So I am describing the worst things that I know about. Pity the poor pro-life student who might be watching me talk to a relativist. Because and I'm not going to say this is something that you should necessarily do, but I have chosen to expose myself to certain horrible stories from history of horrible, horrible things being done to people, so that when the time comes, I can graphically describe it to a relativist with the hope that I can help him see that at least one thing is wrong. And I've got lots of different examples I can give. I'm not going to share any right now, don't worry. I'm just saying, I spent hours and hours and hours learning horrible things for this reason. And it occasionally works. It often doesn't. The other way that you can go, very briefly, that you can read another article that Tim wrote called Relating to Relativists, is to basically say, you're right, if you're not a Christian, or if you don't believe in some kind of a moral lawgiver, maybe it doesn't make sense to believe in objective moral laws. And I think that you should believe in an objective moral lawgiver, because clearly some things are wrong. So there's two different ways that you can approach that, and I see them as two tools for your toolbox, just kind of ready to pull out. And so I would encourage you to read both those articles. So that's the relativist. Actually, I'll say one other thing. So your relativist is actually worse. Your relativist is one of the worst kinds of relativists, because he is not just a relativist about moral facts. He's a relativist about all facts. This is less common. To say that maybe 1 + 1 can be 3 to someone is the worst thing I've ever heard a relativist say. I mean, not worse. I mean, I've heard relativists say things, well, maybe rape is okay. Like, I've heard really disgusting things come out of relativism. But, like, this is so problematic. And I would be pushing so hard against that being possible. And just try to help them see there's a contradiction. But it's probably not going to work that day, and don't feel like a failure when he walks away still a relativist. You will almost never turn them around in one day. But sometimes you can just note, like, it seems like it's... Last thing I'll say about relativism. It is very hard to live life consistently as a relativist. There's a pro-life leader, a male leader. The story is attributed to Father Pavone. I think it's true of Father Frank Pavone. Like, he one time did a panel thing with a bunch of pro-choice female leaders, like feminist types. And at some point, someone said, well, like the woman next to him was like, that might be your truth, but that's not my truth. I can have my own moral beliefs, and they don't mean anything. Like, your moral beliefs don't mean anything. And so he didn't say anything. He just quietly reached over and took her purse and started going through it and started pulling stuff out. And she's like, what are you doing? He's like, oh, look, in my moral worldview, it's not wrong to steal. I'm going through your purse. Like, what do you think I'm doing? Like, that kind of thing. She's like, you can't do that. He's like, why? That's your truth. It's not true to me. It kind of exposes, we know as a relativist when the car gets stolen. They're like, oh, it's so wrong. Kind of. Anyway, okay. You asked about, where was the second case, the second situation again?
That one was different. It was a human does not have human rights.
Yes. Yeah, it might be human. So as a clarification question, do you think that the person, when they said this, meant that it's biologically human, meaning like a member of our species, but it's not a person yet? Do you think that's what they meant?
Well, perhaps.
You understand this distinction? So you got science and philosophy here, and pro-lifers mix them up all the time. It's super confusing. Like we say the phrase human being. It's like, what do you mean by human being? Do you mean human? Do you mean person? Because philosophers tend to say person when they're talking about rights and value. And human, I think usually when pro-choice people say human, what they mean is just a member of our species. It's like a biological fact. It's about your DNA, about your species membership. So I'm guessing that's what she meant. She's like, it's biologically human, but it's not a person yet. That's the standard pro-choice view. It is not very common anymore to hear a pro-choice person say that it is not alive or human at conception or fertilization. Like, that used to be more common like 30 years ago. And then a whole lot of ultrasounds happened, and a lot of embryologists learned a lot of things about how even like the 12 to 24-hour process of fertilization, now we know a lot about. And when exactly life begins and all this stuff. And there was a recent study done of thousands of embryologists. These are the scientists that are specialized in that field. And 96% of them said that at fertilization, you have a living human organism. Most of those embryologists are not pro-life. Most of those embryologists are not theists. They're atheists. Most of them are pro-choice. Most of them are left, are on the left side of politics. But they're like, as a scientific question, yes, it's a living human organism. But you should be able to have an abortion because of other things, because of bodily autonomy, or it's not a person yet, or whatever, or both. Usually both. But the scientific question is not really in question. So pro-choice people, at least the educated ones, don't tend to say it's not a human. You get that like in YouTube debate comments, threads. Like that's a whole different thing. Or Facebook debates. You get people saying stranger things there. But like, if you're talking to people like on college campuses, you're just not going to hear that very often. They don't think it's a person, and or they think her bodily autonomy trumps the rights of the child. Like almost every time. And there might be other things, like they might be like concerned about the potential consequences of making abortion illegal. Does this mean that people would die? People like Savita, or people in like back alley abortions or things like that. Like you got people like that, or people who are just like, look, like just have a lot of compassion. Like it just seems like women, if they're very poor, or women who are raped, they should be allowed to have abortions. Like there's something like that going on, where there's just an assumption that the unborn is not a person. But not very many people are saying it's not human. So I would say that that person you're talking to is very common as far as pro-choice views go, and I would definitely encourage to talk to her a lot. The relativist, that's going to be tough. And so I'll end on this note, because I think it's important for pro-life people to be healthy and to take care of themselves. While we're thinking about the relativist who says maybe 1 + 1 is 3 to some people, there are certain people, if you are having an unproductive conversation, you need to understand that you are not morally obligated to keep on talking to that person for as long as they're willing to talk to you. Because conversations can get very unproductive. If I'm talking to someone who is closed-minded, talking to a closed-minded person is kind of like playing tennis against a wall. You might get better, but you're not affecting the wall. Like when it's two open-minded, reasonable people get together, that's where the magic happens, right? Where both of you are open to maybe being wrong and are truth seekers. That's where the magic happens. So if I'm talking to someone who's closed-minded, and I've taken some time and given them a chance to maybe kind of be more open-minded, I'm out. If I'm talking to someone who's really hostile, really mean, I'm out. Not right away. I'll let them vent at me for a while. Sometimes they just need to get that out of their system. But if after they should know better, they should know like I'm not one of those pro-lifers or whatever that's in their head. If she keeps on attacking me as this hateful, awful jerk, I can't help her. Like she's not going to listen to a jerk. And so, or who she perceives to be a jerk. And so I really like something that my friend Jonlyn Fincher said. She said, Christians often make the mistake of trying to force feed arguments into people's mouths who don't want it. And we shouldn't do that. If they're interested in the dialogue, good. Keep on talking. The long conversations, I think, are the best ones. It takes more than 10 minutes to usually change someone's mind about anything. I love the conversations where I've got an hour or more with someone. Or even better, a series of conversations where you can form a friendship with this person and be meeting regularly at Starbucks or whatever, and talking about the issue. Or you're building trust, you're building rapport, you're building on previous arguments that you've made, and then eventually they become pro-life, as has happened in multiple of my friendships that I've had, but friendships that have lasted 2 to 6 years before they change their mind. But at a matter of self-care, because I need you in this movement. We need people like you who are trained and equipped to have dialogue. You will run yourself ragged if you are like, I've got to convince that girl that 1 + 1 is 2. I've got to do it. I've got to figure it out. I don't care how many conversations it takes. I'm going to bang my head against this brick wall until I've convinced her that 1 + 1 is 2. At some point, I would just give up. Some people are not open at that point. And I want you in it for the long haul. and talking to people who are more open-minded and more likely to change their mind about abortion. And you do that, you have enough conversations in this country and convince enough pro-lifers to vote pro-life first, and you convince enough pro-choice people that Savita didn't have to die, and that being pro-life is not just a religious thing, and that we actually have the best philosophical arguments, it becomes possible to abolish abortion in Ireland. Thank you very much. God bless you.